Good evening, everybody. So this is the first time I've done a full-length lesson here. So I'm a big believer in setting expectations. So I want to kind of set expectations. I won't have to do this every time I get up here, but I think it's important the first time. So the first thing to know is that I'm probably going to spend some time in Joshua. That's just how I roll. So you might want to put a bookmarker there. Anytime you see me, it's a good idea that Joshua is going to be in the lesson. So just kind of think about that one. The second one is I'm probably going to cry. It happens. I don't know. I blame it on having kids. Something switched when I turned 27 and had kids, and I can't control it. It just happens. So expect that. Now, if someone wants to yell out and say it's okay, it won't offend me, but just let me have my moment, I guess. And the third expectation is that the humor will be dry. And you really won't get it until probably tomorrow. And that's okay. My humor is like a bowl of chili or a pot of chili. It gets better over time, and the second day is usually the best. So with those expectations kind of set, when I was asked to do the lesson, I didn't realize that I would be doing the pregame show for tonight. It really kind of caught me off guard when I realized that this was the pregame for the Super Bowl. And so what I'm going to try to do is deliver solid biblical content, and we're going to try to keep it under control so that this doesn't turn into the halftime show. And so we'll try to keep it just a pregame only. A while back, I heard a question posed that I thought was rather interesting, and that question was, what is the greatest threat to the church today? And when I heard that question, I immediately had some thoughts in my mind. Maybe some ideas kind of jumped out in your mind when I posed the question. What is the greatest threat to the church today? At that moment, I immediately started thinking about, the culture, right? It's things like people's blatant disrespect for God. It's things we see on TV. It's the social media things that we see, the memes that we come across. It's all the things that we see out in the world, whether it's media, TV, the Grammy Awards. All those things are threats to the church today. But after I kind of, I'm a thinker. I like to sit and contemplate things. So I'm a man of few words, but I like to think a lot. And so after I think a lot about that, I thought about it, and I didn't really like those answers. I didn't think that the culture was really the greatest threat to the church today. When I thought about it some more, I guess the first thing I did is you'll notice that my answers are really kind of pointing out there, right? What's the greatest threat to the church? Well, it's something out there, right? It's somebody else. It's other things out in this world. And the problems are all coming kind of external to the building. There was something outside of me. And, that list is really easy to put together. You kind of think about it really quickly, and it comes to your mind quickly. Well, it didn't take me long to kind of realize that I don't think those are the right answers to that question. I think there's something else. So I essentially, what the answers to that question, what I came up with was those are things that are in a sinful world. Right? The culture, the bad things we see, the disrespect for God. Those are things that are in the sinful world. And what I said is that those sinful things threaten the church. That was my thought, right? Well, the world's been sinful for a really long time, right? And God's people have always endured that. There's always been a remnant there. And that's not to say that there's not troubles and that the world doesn't cause us some level of trouble, but I don't think the true threat to the church is a sinful world. I'm reminded of what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 16, if you'll want to turn there, Matthew 16. And you may know where I'm going. Matthew 16, this is where Jesus is talking to his disciples. Matthew 16, beginning in verse 15. Jesus asked them a question. He says, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." If if the gates of hell can't prevail against the church, then I submit to say that the sin that we see in the world today cannot threaten the church either. So I return to the original question. I think sometimes you ask a question, you think about it, well, there's something there. There's a good question there, but that's not the right question. So I went back and I said, let me come up with a different question. So I come up with a different question, and I think the question I want to talk about tonight is, and this may not be the best question. There may be another question. So after you think about this, maybe the actual question is different. But here's the question I want to pose tonight. What is the biggest threat to us as God's people in our ability to continue to serve God in this present day? Or put another way, what will threaten my service to God today? Once again, I think it's real easy for us to think outwardly, right? To think that maybe the social norms of the world today, the peer pressure from those that we work with or that we go to school with. And, without a doubt, the workplace norms, the school place norms are definitely changing. We see God's name taken in vain, blatantly. We see God's people mocked or ridiculed in various areas. There's even, political pressure for us to act or behave in such a way that definitely is not God-like. And in whatever social engagement, these social norms that we find ourselves in, we may think or feel like it's more difficult for us to obey and serve God. And so I have an example of that. I've been on a job search recently, some of you know, and I came across a job posting that was, honestly, it was perfect. I mean, this was the perfect job for me. It was in the tech world. It was overseeing the product marketing for this company's technology products and services. And not only that, it was in the travel industry. And if you know anything about me, I love going places, love traveling, whether it's camping, flying, RVing, it doesn't matter. I like to go. And so this particular job was in the travel industry. And I started doing some research on the company, as I like to do, and came across their LinkedIn posts. And that's when I learned about their involvement in sponsorship and the corporate day that they had honoring Transgender Visibility Week. That was really disappointing to me. And I knew that I could not in good conscience apply for that job, but I kind of started thinking, what if I found myself in that situation? I know that there's people here that work for companies whose policies and kind of outward-facing stances are kind of diametrically opposed to what we believe and the values that we hold. So do those things, the fact that you do work for that company or you find yourself working for that type of thing or the social norms in that work, do those things keep us and make it harder for us to follow Christ? Are they a threat to our service? No, I don't think those are. I think that if we find it hard to serve God when the world around us is changing, the norms that we come across are different than what we have or the beliefs that we hold, I think that's really a symptom of another problem. And I believe that the things that are the bigger threat to the church and our service today are the same things that have threatened God's people throughout all time. There's nothing new. The same threats that affected the children of Israel way back are the same threats that face us today. And I'm not talking about, by the way, the physical well-being, the physical threats that we may face. I'm really talking about our spiritual well-being. I don't think those threats are external. Not all of them are external. We're going to talk about one external one later tonight, but I don't think all of them are external. And so rather than looking outward and saying, there's the problem, I think we should look inside ourselves. I want to focus on three things that I think are true, that are the true threat to us serving God tonight. And there won't be a PowerPoint. I'm sorry for all the people who like taking notes and stuff. I thought that we'd just keep the Bill Hall thing rolling here, and we'll just kind of talk through them. So the first thing that I think is a threat to our service to God is our personal or individual lack of faith. And to combat that, I think we have to build our faith. Our lack of faith individually is a threat to serving God. Is our faith strong? Is our faith weak? What is it? Brother Hall brought this up during the meeting last week, and I wanted to turn to the account of Joshua and Caleb. Told you. I want to go back to Joshua and Caleb in Numbers chapter 13. And in Numbers chapter 13, we have an example of, or the story, the account of the 10 spies, the 12 spies, and 10 of them coming back and giving a certain account, and Joshua and Caleb giving a different account. Numbers chapter 13, beginning in verse 25. At the end of 40 days, they returned from spying out the land. And they came to Moses and Aaron and to the congregation of all the people of Israel in the wilderness of Paran and at Kadesh, and brought back word to them and to all the congregation, showed them the fruit of the land. And they told him, "We came to the land which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negeb. The Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites dwell in the hill country, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan." They saw a lot of external forces that were a threat to them. 10 spies looked out into Canaan and saw problems. The giants are too big. The cities are too strong. They saw a lot of problems that they felt that they couldn't overcome. And I think if we think about this metaphor I'm trying to make, is we say the same things today. We say that Hollywood is too powerful. We say that politics are corrupt. We say that TV is garbage. The phones are corrupting our kids. How are we supposed to grow the church? Told you I'd do it. What is that? Someone give me tips afterward how to not make that happen. How are we supposed to grow the church and bring people to Christ under those conditions? If it's so bad out there, how are we supposed to succeed? Well, just like the things the spies saw, those things are true. They were big. The cities were fortified. Hollywood is corrupt. Politics are terrible. All those things are true. We see a lot of that in our world today. But what is our attitude? What are the circumstances that we find ourselves in relative to the same circumstances that the children of Israel found themselves in before they went into the land? Do we have the same reaction? Do we say, let's just give up, let's go home, there's no use? Or do we react like Joshua and Caleb? Let's look at verse 30. Verse 30 says, "But Caleb quieted the people before Moses and said, 'Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it.'" Turn a page or two over down to Numbers 14. We'll pick up in verse 7. Joshua is now talking. He says, "This land," this is Numbers 14, verse 7, "the land which we passed through to spy it out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into the land and give it to us. A land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them." Joshua and Caleb saw the problem differently. What was the difference? I believe it was their faith, and that they knew that with God's help, they could overcome the challenges that were in the land. So when we look out in the world today, do we look out with fear and say that there's no way we can defeat whatever we see, the sin, the evil, all the things out there? Or do we look at it and say that we have to use our carnal weapons? I love that analogy that Brother Hall made last week. Another great lesson that he had. If we look at the world today and we look at it as if we have to fight it with our carnal weapons, I think it's really easy to feel defeated. Like that's the battle we've got to fight. We've got to fight carnal weapons with the world we have today. Are we going to be able to vote this country into morality? Are we going to be able to support all the right organizations and support all the right associations with our time and money and change the trajectory of the culture? If that's the way we want to fight, I think we're probably fighting the wrong battle or fighting with the wrong weapons. Satan wants us to fight with those weapons. He wants us to fight carnal problems with carnal weapons. I think we have to remember the offensive and the defensive weapons that Paul mentioned in Ephesians 6. I'm not going to turn there, but I think we all know the armor of God. And those are the weapons that Joshua and Caleb were going to use. They were going to rely on our faith. So that was the threat in my mind to the children of Israel. What was the threat before they entered the land? Was it the giants? Was the giants the threat to them? Was it the fortified cities? Was that the threat to them? No. The real threat was the people's lack of faith. That was their threat. So when we look out into the world, do we see giants that we can't defeat? Or do we see a field that is white for harvest? Do we see it optimistically or do we see it pessimistically? All right, point number 2. The second thing I think that we have in terms of the threat to our service to God is our unity and love for each other as believers. Before Jesus was betrayed and arrested, he prayed for his disciples. And I think his prayer in John 17 gives us some insight into what he thought the threat would be for his followers. So in John 17, we're going to start in verse 20. John 17, beginning verse 20. I do not ask for these only, but also for those who believe in me through their word, that they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. The glory that you have given me, I have given to them, that they may be one, even as we are one. I and them and you and me, that they may become perfectly one, so that the world may know that you sent me and loved them, even as you loved me. In that last part, Jesus makes a comment that I really like to key in on from time to time, and that is that our unity with each other is a testimony to the world to let them know that God sent Jesus and that God loved us. That's even mentioned earlier in John. If you turn to John chapter 13, John 13, verse 34 and 35. John 13, 34. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. People know that we are his disciples by the love we show to each other, one another in this. And my question to you is, how does the world see us treat each other? Do they see us treat each other differently? Do they even see us treating each other? Or are we oftentimes too busy and we like to go off and do our own thing individually or as families or whatnot? Does the world even get an opportunity to see us treating each other out in public in a certain way? You know, we have this spiritual weapon that we can use, and it's the love that we have that we can show each other and we can show our fellow man, even our neighbor, if you will. Let's return to the idea of unity for a second. I bet you can't guess where I'm going to go. Joshua. You turn to Joshua, chapter 24. Joshua 24. Joshua 24, verse 14. This is at the end of Joshua's life. They've gone in, they've inhabited the land, and this is Joshua's farewell address. Joshua 24, part of Joshua's farewell address. We're real familiar with this. He says, this is beginning in verse 14. Now therefore, fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt and serve the Lord. And if it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your fathers served in the region beyond the river or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Listen to this next part, because this is where the unity of the people shines through. Verse 16. Then the people answered, far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord. They're all saying this together. The people said this. Far be it from us that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. For it is the Lord our God who brought us and our fathers up from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, and who did those great signs in our sight and preserved us in all the way that we went. and among all the peoples through whom we passed. And the Lord drove out before us all the peoples, the Amorites who lived in the land. Therefore we also will serve the Lord, for he is our God. When that group, in that moment, we know what happens later in the book of Judges. Their unity, their faith was weak. But in that moment, we see real unity and faithfulness toward God. If we fast forward and look to the days of the early church, we also find Paul's exhortation for unity and love among the brethren, Ephesians 4. If you'd like to turn there, Ephesians 4. I'm going to start in verse 1. Ephesians 4, verse 1. I, therefore, a prisoner for the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope that belongs to your call, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. We skip down to verse 16. From whom the whole body, joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love. I find it interesting that in the verses following the exhortation, the verses following this, down in verse 17 through the rest of that Paul has this exhortation and wants to make sure that their walk wasn't like the Gentiles who were alienated from God. I think Paul knew that they needed to be together, that they needed to be unified, that they needed to have faith and a love for each other and a bond with each other, to resist those that were forsaking the faith, that were going outside, returning to their own life. It's that bond, that unity that brings us together, that holds us, that makes it easier for us, if you will, to serve God. So when our faith is strong, when we're unified, and when we demonstrate our love for each other, that's a pretty strong defense against the threats of this world. All right, there's a third thing. And this is more of the external thing. And that third thing is false teaching. That is a threat to our service to God. And we battle that by sealing out that threat. And I think we can seal out that threat with our faith and our unity and love for each other. But in terms of sealing out, I have a story. When we first moved into our house, this was 2014, our house that we live here in Athens now. The previous owners had just completed a number of renovations, a number of upgrades. And that, which was perfect, because the last thing I wanted when looking for a new house was a house full of projects. I did not want to have a lot of projects. There will be other times for other projects, but I didn't want to move into a project. And so this house that we found was perfect. All the bathrooms had been renovated, the kitchen had been redone, everything was ready, new, updated, everything was ready to go. And so we moved in at the beginning of summer, and everything was great. We painted a few walls and that sort of thing. That was the only projects we had to do. But that fall, one day I came down from, to the kitchen and opened. By the way, this story is going to have mice in it, so if that makes anybody squeamish, just know that that's coming. So anyway, I came down to the pantry, opened the pantry door, and there it was. The signs that a visitor had been partaking of some food and had left the processed and filtered remains of what they had eaten there behind. And since we had just moved in, I was not really up on trying to move out of the house. So I blocked a lot of those memories out since that day, but later on, either that day or later that evening, or maybe it was the next day, we found other evidence of mice in the bathrooms and the hallway. And what had happened is, after they had redone the bathrooms and the kitchen, they had messed around with some plumbing, and all the lines were kind of open and exposed to the wall. So after some patching up and that good stuff, spray, all the things were sealed out. The analogy here, I hope, maybe it's bad, but the analogy here I want to make is that those are like false teachers coming into the church in one particular way. Those cracks, those openings, the lack of seal allows those things, those varmints to come into the house, and it will allow false teachers to come into our midst. The lack of our weak faith, or our weak unity, or less strong love for each other, those are cracks that Satan can exploit and result in false teaching. And false teaching is obviously a threat to our service to God. And it's mentioned a number of times in the New Testament. I'm not going to read all these verses, but Acts 20, it's mentioned that fierce wolves will come in among us. 1 Timothy 4, it talks about deceitful spirits and teachings of demons that people fall into traps. 2 Timothy chapter 4, it talks about false teachers turning away and causing people to turn away from listening to the truth and people wandering off into myths. 2 Peter 2:1, false teachers who secretly bring in destructive heresies. So false teachers is obviously a threat to our service to God. And it would be really nice, like the mice, if we could put a sticky trap out there by the door and catch every false teacher that walks in and catch them that way. But unfortunately, the fight of our false teaching cannot use those carnal weapons like sticky traps. We have to use the spiritual weapons that God has given us. And so our elders obviously have a tough job protecting the flock from false teaching, and it's certainly a way that the culture can get in and cause problems and false ideas that can get into the church and cause a threat. So the first two things I think are ways, like I mentioned before, our faith and our unity and love for each other are ways that we can build up and seal out false teaching. If we build those things up, hopefully we'll be able to identify those false teachings and leave them outside where they belong. All right, those are my three things: our faith, our love and unity, and false teaching. There's been a lot of talk recently about, I'm going back to the culture now, about needing another great awakening. And, I like history, and so if one of these days you want to nerd out, invite me over, we can talk about history. It doesn't matter, I'll talk about anything. But, depending on the historian you read, there's been either 3 or 4 periods in our history since the 1700s. I'm talking about the United States history, North American history. 3 or 4 periods since the 1700s that have been considered a revival period or a great awakening period. And even the words revival or camp meeting or gospel meeting have their roots in the second great awakening of the 1800s. And these movements didn't start out by everybody getting together and say, hey, I think it's time to have a great awakening. We need to get everybody together and have a great awakening. And it didn't start out that way. It started by individuals who had faith in God, preaching, writing, using the tactics that they had during the day to get the message out about Jesus Christ to a world that was ready to hear it. And I think the world is ready to hear it. So if you want to see another great awakening in our time, it starts with each one of us, I think, ensuring that our faith is strong, working with each other in love, and showing and demonstrating the bond that we have. There's dangers in our culture, don't get me wrong. Our culture isn't more of a threat, though, in my opinion, than what it was in Roman times, or what it is or has been in any other period in history. Culture is sinful, and sin has always existed, but there's always been believers, and the remnant exists. And we as Christians today can withstand that. We need to look at it in the same way Joshua and Caleb did, that those aren't giants that we can't overcome. That's an opportunity for God to be glorified. So tonight, if you are not a member of this church, if you are not a member of the body of Christ, we encourage you to make that choice tonight. Join this group. Be unified with us. Let's work together. And if you're subject to the invitation and would like to join the group, please come forward as we stand and sing.